Annie Morgan stepped onto the train as if she were being led. Not traveling. The wedding dress had been forced on her before dawn. White and unfamiliar against skin still tender from crying. Her eyes were swollen, the kind of swelling that came from hours of quiet tears. Not hysteria. A faint bruise lingered along her cheekbone, half hidden by powder that had not been applied with care. She kept her gaze fixed on the floorboards, listening to the hiss of steam and the scrape of iron, each sound sealing the choice she had never been given. Harold Graves claimed the seat beside her. He spoke easily of Reno, of timing, of how things would be simpler once they arrived. His voice carried the confidence of a man used to being obeyed. Annie said nothing. Then, at the far end of the car, she felt it before she saw it. A presence. She lifted her eyes and met Michael Walker's gaze, brief, startled, unmistakable. Her breath caught. She sat down at once, folded her hands in her lap, and bowed her head.
God, save me from this marriage. Please don't let this be my life,
she whispered. Before the train reaches its next stop, Annie's life will be forced onto a path she never chose. Stay with this story to understand what brought her to this moment. Like, subscribe, share your thoughts, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support matters more than you know. In the early 1880s, Nevada was a place that took more than it gave and called it opportunity. The mining towns around Virginia City had been built quickly and carelessly, as if everyone believed the earth would forgive them for tearing it open. Wooden buildings leaned toward one another like tired men. The air carried the smell of dust, smoke, and something metallic that never quite left the back of the throat. People came here chasing luck and stayed because leaving required money, strength, or both. Annie Morgan had grown up learning that lesson without ever choosing it. Her father, William Morgan, had come west when the mines still promised a future. By the time Annie was old enough to remember him coming home at night, that promise had thinned to habit. He worked underground 6 days a week, breathing air that scraped his lungs raw. Coughing into a handkerchief he tried to hide from her. Everyone knew what the mines did to men's bodies. No one talked about it unless they had to. Illness was common. Debt was inevitable. By the time Annie reached her 20s, the town had taught her what it expected from women like her: keep quiet, keep going, and do not ask for more than survival. She learned how to stretch meals, how to boil water twice when medicine ran out, how to read a man's mood before he spoke. She also learned that grief and dignity were luxuries the poor were not allowed to display for long. The mines did not just own the land, they owned the town. Men who worked underground answered to overseers who answered to men like Harold Graves. Graves controlled wages, supplies, and credit. When sickness came, the mine extended help in the form of loans that never truly helped. The numbers grew quietly, like mold in the dark, until one day they were read aloud and could no longer be ignored. Annie understood all of this not as history, but as routine. It was simply how life worked where she lived. Michael Walker existed in that same routine. Though Annie did not know his story in full, only the pieces she had seen. He was younger than most of the men in William's crew, lean in a way that came from hunger rather than youth. When Annie passed the mine entrance with medicine for her father, she sometimes saw Michael standing apart, wiping dust from his hands, his jaw set as if holding something back. There were bruises on him too, the kind men pretended came from accidents. In town, Michael was quiet. He did not drink much. He did not laugh loudly. He watched. Annie noticed him without meaning to, not because he tried to be seen, but because he never did, when their eyes met once by the supply store. Another time near the boarding house, there was a flicker of recognition that unsettled her. It felt dangerous to acknowledge another person too clearly in a place that punished attachment. She told herself it was nothing. She had learned to tell herself that about many things. As William's health worsened, the rhythm of Annie's days narrowed. Morning meant checking his breathing. Afternoon meant errands and borrowed remedies. Evening meant listening to him cough until sleep took him. The past and the future both shrank until there was only the present, and the present was fragile. That was when Harold Graves began to appear more often. He never raised his voice. He never needed to. He stood in their doorway and spoke of figures, of obligations, of time running out. He looked at William not as a man, but as a failing investment. Annie stood nearby and felt herself becoming something else in his calculations, something transferable. She did not yet know how much. In the wider world, the railroads had made movement easier than it had ever been. Trains ran through Nevada carrying ore, money, machinery, and men who believed speed equaled progress. To Annie, the railroad was not a symbol of freedom. It was a reminder that other lives existed just beyond her reach, moving forward while hers remained anchored to a sickbed and a ledger of debt. By the time winter settled over the hills and William's cough turned wet and frightening, Annie understood one truth with painful clarity: history was not something that happened long ago. It was happening to her, quietly, every day, shaped by men who would never remember her name. And somewhere within that narrowing world, a choice was being prepared whether she wanted it or not. Annie did not think of herself as a woman who noticed men. Life in the mining towns did not leave much room for that kind of attention. Desire felt impractical, even dangerous, like standing too close to an open shaft. Yet Michael Walker slipped into her awareness not as a longing, but as a presence, quiet, persistent, impossible to fully ignore. She noticed him first in fragments, the way he stood near the edge of a group, never fully inside it, the way his shoulders tightened whenever an overseer passed too close, the way his hands, rough and scarred, moved carefully when he helped an older miner, as if gentleness were something he had to practice in secret. Annie saw him most often when she brought medicine to the mine entrance for her father. The men came up in waves, coughing, spitting black into the dirt, their faces blurred together by dust and fatigue. Michael always emerged a few steps behind the others. He never looked directly at her then, but she felt his attention like a held breath. Once, when her basket slipped and a bottle shattered against the ground, it was Michael who bent down first to help her gather the pieces. Their fingers did not touch. He kept his eyes on the dirt, handed her what he could salvage, and stepped back without a word. Yet Annie's heart raced as if something improper had passed between them. She told herself it was only nerves. There were rules in places like Virginia City, unspoken ones that everyone learned early. You did not look too long. You did not ask questions that might invite answers. And you certainly did not hope for anything that required permission from men with power. Annie obeyed those rules the way she obeyed gravity. Still, there were moments when she forgot. At the supply store, she once caught Michael watching her as she counted coins twice before handing them over. His expression was not pity, it was recognition. That unsettled her more than kindness would have. She turned away quickly, cheeks warming, angry at herself for wanting to be seen. At the boarding house one evening, she passed him on the stairs. He moved aside to let her through, his body tense, as if the space between them were charged. For an instant, their eyes met. Michael looked away first. That night, Annie lay awake longer than usual, listening to her father's breathing and wondering why the thought of a man she barely knew had followed her into the dark. Michael, for his part, kept his distance on purpose. From where Annie stood, he was simply quiet. From where he stood, silence was survival. He had learned early that speaking out earned bruises, and caring too much earned worse. He saw Annie's life narrowing day by day, saw it in the way her shoulders curved inward, in the way she learned to disappear while still standing in plain sight. He also saw Harold Graves watching her. The first time Michael noticed it, a slow heat had risen in his chest, unfamiliar and unwelcome. Graves looked at Annie the way men looked at land they meant to claim. Michael recognized that look. He had seen it in the mines, in the way bodies were measured by output and cost. Michael knew better than to intervene. Men like him did not interfere with men like Graves and lived to regret it quietly. So he did what he had always done. He watched, he endured. He swallowed his anger and turned it into something harder. Annie sensed none of this directly. What she felt was subtler and more confusing. Around Michael, the air seemed to shift. He never spoke to her beyond necessity, never lingered where he might be accused of interest. And yet, in a town that demanded invisibility from women like her, his restraint felt like a tension. She began to notice her own reactions with unease. How she straightened when she saw him. How her breath caught when she realized he had been standing nearby longer than she thought. How she imagined, briefly and foolishly, what it might be like to speak freely to someone who understood the cost of silence. She scolded herself for it. Dreams did not feed sick men. Feelings did not pay debts. As William's condition worsened, Annie's world tightened further. Her days were consumed by care, her nights by worry. And yet, even then, there were moments when she felt Michael's presence like a distant anchor, something solid in a place that kept shifting under her feet. Neither of them spoke of it. Neither of them named it. But the silence between them grew heavier with each passing week, charged with things that had no safe place to go. And in that silence, without either of them realizing it, something fragile and dangerous was taking shape, waiting for the moment when restraint would no longer be enough. Illness changed the shape of time inside the Morgan house. Days no longer moved forward so much as they pressed inward, each one folding into the next. Annie learned to measure them by sound, the rattle in her father's chest before dawn, the brief quiet when medicine eased it, the coughing that returned by evening like a tide that could not be held back. William Morgan tried to pretend the mines had not taken more than they were owed. He still spoke of work in the future tense, when he was better, when the weather warmed, when the doctor came again. Annie nodded and let him believe it, even as she learned to recognize the look in his eyes when the pain settled too deep to hide. He apologized often, for the cost of medicine, for the worry, for being a burden. Each apology landed in her like a stone. She told him it was nothing. She told him they would manage. That was when Harold Graves began to come more frequently. At first, he sent messages, polite reminders, delivered by clerks who would not meet her eyes. Then he came himself. He never arrived angry. He stood just inside the doorway, hat in hand, speaking in a measured voice about figures and timelines. He talked about loans, the way other men talked about weather, as if no one could reasonably object. Annie listened, hands folded, her spine straight. She did not interrupt. She did not plead. She had learned that desperation only sharpened men like Graves. "Your father's account has grown," he said one afternoon, glancing past her toward the sickbed. "Medical credit is expensive." Annie nodded. She already knew the numbers by heart. She could see them whenever she closed her eyes. Graves did not threaten her. He did not need to. The threat lived in the pauses between his words, in the way his gaze lingered on the room, on the thinness of their life. He spoke of solutions without naming them. He spoke of patience while making it clear that his patience had limits. When he left, the house felt smaller. Annie sat beside her father and spooned water to his lips, forcing herself to breathe evenly. She told herself this was still manageable, that debts were only numbers, that numbers could be negotiated. She clung to that belief with the stubbornness of someone who had nothing else to hold. Outside the house, Michael Walker felt the pressure building long before he understood its shape. He saw it in the way Annie moved now more cautiously, as if the ground beneath her might give way without warning. He saw it in the way Graves watched her in town, his attention no longer subtle. Once, Michael caught the overseer's eye while Graves stood nearby. The message was clear enough. Mind your place. Michael minded it. He had no choice. But each day in the mines sharpened something in him. The beatings grew more casual, more efficient. The men were pushed harder. The air grew worse. And William Morgan was forced underground long after he should have been spared. Michael watched the older man stagger and cough, watched him wipe blood from his mouth when he thought no one was looking. Something settled in Michael's chest, then not rage exactly, but a cold resolve that frightened him with its clarity. Annie did not know this. What she knew was that the world was asking more of her than she had left to give. When the medicine ran out and she had to choose which dose to skip, she did so without crying. When the doctor stopped coming because the account was too far behind, she thanked him anyway. Each small surrender felt necessary. Each one also felt like a step towards something she refused to imagine. The day William collapsed in the mine came without drama. A man knocked on the door and spoke softly, as if volume might make the news worse. Annie walked to the site on unsteady legs, her mind blank, her heart beating with mechanical insistence. William survived that day. He did not recover. After that, Graves stopped pretending. He spoke more plainly. He stood closer. He mentioned, at last, the word Annie had felt circling her life like a bird of prey. Marriage. Not as affection, not as choice, as settlement. Annie felt the room tilt when he said it. She did not answer. She could not. The thought lodged in her chest, heavy and unreal. She told herself it was only a suggestion, that she would find another way, that there was always another way. But when William's breathing worsened again, when the nights filled with the sound of a man drowning on dry land, Annie began to understand what Graves had understood all along. Debt did not need to shout. It waited. It watched. And eventually, it asked for something that could not be counted or repaid. Annie stood at her father's bedside one night, holding his hand as his breath hitched and slowed. She realized then that the choice forming around her was not between happiness and sacrifice. It was between submission and survival. She did not yet know how she would choose. She only knew that time, like mercy, was running out. William Morgan died in the early hours of a morning that looked no different from the ones before it. The sky was the same dull gray, the kind that pressed low over the hills and made the town feel smaller than it already was. Annie had been awake most of the night, counting her father's breaths until they no longer followed any pattern she recognized. When the sound finally stopped, it did not announce itself. There was no sudden silence, no dramatic moment, just an absence that took her several heartbeats to understand. She sat very still, her hands still wrapped around his, waiting for the next breath to come and correct her mistake. It did not. The doctor arrived too late to matter. He spoke softly, avoided her eyes, and confirmed what she already knew. Annie thanked him out of habit. Gratitude had become reflex. When he left, the house felt hollowed out, as if the walls themselves had lost their purpose. Annie washed her father's body with care. She moved slowly, methodically, as if gentleness might be the one thing she could still offer him. She dressed him in his best shirt, the one he had worn on Sundays when he still believed rest could heal a man. As she worked, memories surfaced without warning. His laugh when she was small, the way he used to lift her onto his shoulders before the coughing began. She swallowed each memory down, afraid that if she let herself feel them fully, she would not be able to finish what needed to be done. By midday, the news had spread. In mining towns, death was common, but it was never ignored. Men removed their hats. Women brought bread and coffee they could barely spare. The church bell rang once, then again, its sound thin against the wind. Annie stood among them, nodding, thanking, holding herself together with a discipline she did not recognize as her own. Michael Walker came, though he stood at the edge of the gathering, near the trees. Annie saw him there without turning her head. She felt his presence the way she felt the cold, unavoidable, sharp, grounding. He didn't come closer. He didn't speak. His hat hung low, his expression sealed tight. But when she finally lifted her gaze, their eyes found each other, and what passed between them was not comfort, not hope, but a quiet, unspoken understanding. The burial took place that afternoon. The grave was shallow, the earth stiff with cold, as the final prayers were spoken. Annie felt a strange calm settle over her. The worst had already happened, she told herself. Whatever came next could not be worse than this. She was wrong. Harold Graves arrived before the dirt had fully settled. He did not wait for the others to leave. He did not lower his voice. He approached Annie where she stood beside the grave, her hands numb, her thoughts distant. He spoke as if this were an ordinary meeting delayed by inconvenience. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, and the words sounded practiced. "We should talk." Annie stared at him. For a moment, she did not understand what he meant. The world tilted slightly, as if her mind were slow to catch up. "This is not the time," she said. Her voice sounded far away to her own ears. Graves sighed, a small display of patience. Time is precisely the issue. He spoke of debts, of outstanding accounts, of how illness complicated matters. He spoke as if William Morgan were a ledger entry, already closed. Annie felt the air leave her lungs with each word. "I will work," she said. "I will pay it back. Just not today." Graves looked at her then, truly looked, and something in his expression shifted. Calculation replaced courtesy. "You misunderstand," he said. "There are debts that cannot be worked off." Annie felt the meaning settle over her like a weight. No, he did not raise his voice when he answered. "Yes." People nearby grew quiet. Someone shifted uncomfortably. No one intervened. This, too, was familiar. Graves stepped closer. He spoke of marriage as resolution, of stability, of protection. He framed it as generosity. Annie heard none of it clearly. Her pulse roared in her ears. "I won't," she said. The word came out hoarse, but it was solid, real. For the first time, Graves showed irritation. The slap came without warning. It was sharp and efficient, delivered with the same economy of motion Graves used in business. Annie felt the impact before she felt the pain. Her vision blurred. The ground rushed up to meet her knees, then her hands, then her face. She could not stand. The cold seeped into her palms, into her cheek pressed against the dirt that covered her father's grave. Sounds reached her as if from underwater. Someone gasped. Someone else muttered her name. Annie did not lift her head. She stared at the earth inches from her eyes and felt something inside her finally give way, not breaking, but emptying. The rules she had lived by, the belief that endurance was enough, the hope that patience would be rewarded. They left her there. In that moment, Annie did not think of anger. She did not think of escape. She thought of how tired she was. Her lips moved without her fully realizing it. The prayer that came was not eloquent or proper. It was raw and stripped of pride. "Please," she whispered. Her voice barely sounded at all. "Please don't let this be all there is." She did not ask for justice. She did not ask for revenge. She asked for a way out. When she finally felt hands on her shoulders, lifting her gently, she did not know whose they were. Later, she would remember Michael's eyes watching from the edge of the graveyard, something dark and unyielding settling behind them. But in that moment, Annie Morgan lay against the ground that had taken her father and understood, with terrible clarity, that her life as it had been was over. Whatever came next would not be chosen gently, and it would not wait. The morning Annie Morgan was dressed as a bride, she felt nothing at all. That frightened her more than the grief had. The women who came to help spoke softly, as if volume might bruise her. They tightened laces, smoothed fabric, adjusted a veil that felt absurd in her hands. Someone dabbed powder over the fading mark on her cheek, careful not to ask how it had gotten there. Annie let them work. Resistance required energy she no longer possessed. When they were finished, she looked at her reflection and failed to recognize the woman staring back. The dress was white, borrowed, too fine for the narrow room. It turned her into something ceremonial, something meant to be displayed and transferred. She wondered briefly if her father would have recognized her like this. The thought passed without tears. Harold Graves arrived on time. He did not offer his arm. He did not ask if she was ready. He informed her they would be traveling by rail to Reno, where the arrangements had already been made. The word arrangements landed heavily. Annie followed him outside, the cold air sharp against her skin, the station already alive with steam and noise. The train waited, iron and impatient. As Annie stepped onto the platform, she felt the weight of the town behind her, the mine entrances, the narrow streets, the grave freshly cut into the earth. No one stopped her. No one spoke her name. In places like this, departures were common. Only the manner of them differed. Inside the carriage, Harold Graves claimed the seat beside her. He spoke as the train lurched forward, explaining details she did not need to hear. Times, witnesses, the efficiency of doing things properly. Annie stared straight ahead, hands folded tightly in her lap, nails pressing crescents into her skin. Then, without knowing why, she lifted her eyes. Michael Walker sat near the far end of the car. For a moment, the world narrowed to the space between them. His posture was rigid, as if he had not yet decided whether to move or stay still. His eyes flicked to her dress, then to her face, and Annie saw understanding arrive there, in stages recognition, shock, something like pain. She wondered what he saw. A bride, a bruise, a woman who had not chosen this. Their gazes held for a breath too long. Annie felt something twist painfully in her chest, sharp and unfamiliar. She looked away first, lowering herself into the seat as if the act might make her smaller, safer. The train gathered speed. The town slid past the windows and began to disappear. Harold Graves continued talking. He spoke of how people would understand, how rumors would settle once things were made official. Annie heard her own name spoken in the future tense, attached to his, as if it were already decided. She did not respond. Instead, she bowed her head. The prayer came without ceremony. It was not the kind she had learned as a child. Recited and structured, it rose from a place deeper than habit. Please, she thought, please don't let this be my life. She did not know what she was asking for, only that she could not endure what waited for her at the end of the line. Across the car, Michael Walker forced himself to look away. Seeing Annie like this felt like a blow he had not prepared for. He had known she was in danger. He had known Graves was circling. But the dress, the quiet resignation in her posture, the bruise he could not unsee, turned his unease into something colder and more dangerous. He thought of the mines, of William Morgan coughing blood into the dirt, of the way Annie had knelt in the graveyard and not stood back up. He thought of all the times he had told himself silence was safer. The train rocked gently beneath them, carrying money, paperwork, futures that did not belong to everyone equally. Michael's jaw tightened. When the first sharp command rang out, Annie lifted her head in confusion. The sound was not loud, but it cut cleanly through the car. Another voice followed, firm and controlled, ordering everyone to remain seated. Panic rippled, contained but immediate. Harold Graves stiffened beside her, color draining from his face. Men with guns moved through the carriage. They did not shout. They did not strike anyone. Their instructions were clear, practiced, unmistakable. Valuables were collected. Bags were opened. No one was touched. Annie sat very still. She felt fear. Yes, but beneath it, something else stirred, a sense of inevitability, as if the world were finally answering her in a language she could understand. Michael moved with the others, his face set, his actions precise. When his eyes met Annie's again, there was no time for questions, only certainty. Harold Graves tried to speak, to assert himself. His words fell flat. Authority, Annie realized, was only powerful when others believed in it. Stripped of context, of distance, of deference, it sounded small. The robbery ended as quickly as it had begun. The men withdrew, disappearing between cars, then off the train entirely when it slowed at a remote stretch of track. The carriage was left shaken, silent, but intact. No blood, no screams, only the echo of something irreversible. Michael paused at the door. Annie rose before she fully understood she was moving. The dress caught at her knees. She freed it with a sharp tug and crossed the narrow aisle. Harold Graves spoke her name then, sharp with command. She did not turn. Michael looked at her, surprise flickering across his face.
Take me with you.
Annie said. Her voice did not tremble. In that moment, she was no longer praying. She was choosing for a heartbeat. Michael Walker did not move. The train hissed and slowed, metal crying softly as it fought the grade. Beyond the open door stretched a strip of pale earth and winter grass, empty and unforgiving. This was not a place for promises. It was a place where decisions carried weight because there was no one else to carry them. Michael looked at Annie as if he were seeing her clearly for the first time. Not as William Morgan's daughter, not as Harold Graves' intended, but as a woman standing on the edge of her own life, asking to step beyond it. You don't know what you're asking, he said quietly. I do, Annie answered. Her hands were steady at her sides. I know exactly. Behind her, Harold Graves was shouting now, his voice sharp with fury and disbelief. Annie felt it like wind against her back present, insistent, already losing power. She did not turn. She had spent too long living in response to his voice. Michael's mind raced. He thought of the plan, the risks, the men waiting beyond the tracks. He thought of the rules he had followed his entire life. The ones that said men like him survived by keeping their heads down. And then he thought of the bruise on Annie's face, of her kneeling in the dirt beside her father's grave, of the quiet way she had said, please. He reached out. His hand was rough and scarred, the hand of a man who had worked the earth and been worked by it in return. Annie placed her hand in his without hesitation. The contact was brief but decisive, like the closing of a door behind them. Michael guided her down from the carriage. The drop was short but uncertain. Annie gathered her skirt and stepped into the open, the wind cutting through the thin fabric. Her boots met the ground with a dull thud that seemed to echo far louder than it should have. The train lurched forward again. Harold Graves' voice was lost to the distance as the car began to pull away. Annie watched it go, watched the life that had been arranged for her recede along the rails. She felt no triumph, only a strange, steady calm. Michael did not let go of her hand. They moved quickly, angling away from the tracks toward the low hills where the land folded in on itself. The other men were already there, shadows against the pale ground, watching in silence. No one asked questions. No one needed to. When they reached the shelter of the rocks, Michael finally looked back at Annie. This won't be easy, he said. Annie met his gaze, her breath visible in the cold air. I know, she said, but it will be mine. And for the first time since her father had died, the future did not feel like something closing in. It felt like something opening. They did not stop until the rails were no longer visible, until the sound of the train faded into the wind and the land stretched wide and indifferent around them. Only then did Annie realize how cold she was. The dress offered little protection, its thin layers meant for ceremony, not survival. Michael shrugged out of his coat and draped it over her shoulders without asking. It smelled of dust and iron and smoke of the mines, but beneath it was warmth, real and steady. Annie pulled it close, surprised by the sudden sting of tears, not from fear this time, but from relief. They moved on foot, cutting across shallow draws and low ridges where the ground dipped enough to hide them. The men spread out, quiet and practiced, each one carrying the weight of what they had done without celebration. This was not victory. It was escape, fragile and unfinished. Annie watched them from the corner of her eye, aware of how quickly her life had shifted. Only hours ago, she had been a bride bound for Reno. Now she was something else entirely unnamed, unclaimed, responsible for her own next step. Michael stayed close, not crowding her, but never far enough that she could doubt his presence. Once, when she stumbled on a patch of loose gravel, his hand came to her elbow automatically. The touch was brief, respectful, but it grounded her in a way nothing else had since her father's death. "I don't have much to offer," he said after a while, his voice low. "This wasn't meant to be anything like that." Annie nodded. "I didn't ask for promises." She meant it. What she needed was not rescue or romance. It was room to breathe, room to decide who she would be when no one was forcing her hand. As dusk settled, they reached a place where the land rose sharply, scattered with rock and scrub. A fire was built small and hidden, its light kept low. The men shared what food they had. Annie ate slowly, her hands shaking less now, each simple act chewing, swallowing, sitting without fear of being watched felt like a quiet defiance. When the others turned in, Michael remained awake, staring into the dark. Annie sat beside him, close enough to feel the heat of the fire, not close enough to presume anything else. The silence between them was different now. It no longer pressed. It waited. "I prayed for a way out," she said softly, almost to herself. "I didn't expect it to look like this." Michael glanced at her, the firelight catching the lines of fatigue on his face. "Neither did I." They sat together as the stars came out, scattered and sharp across the Nevada sky. Annie felt the vastness of the land open around her, terrifying and full of possibility. She did not know where they would go next. She did not know what would be lost along the way. But for the first time, the uncertainty did not feel like a threat. It felt like freedom. They went far enough that the past could no longer find them by accident. It took time, months of moving, of careful work taken where it could be found, of learning which questions not to answer. Annie shed the dress early on, trading it for worn fabric and sturdy boots. The bruise on her face faded. The memory of it did not, but it lost its power to command her days. Eventually, they settled in a place quiet enough to hear themselves think. A small stretch of land, imperfect and affordable, where no one asked how they had come by one another. Michael worked the soil the way he had once worked stone steadily. Without complaint, Annie learned the rhythms of planting and harvest, of patience that led somewhere instead of circling back on itself. They married without ceremony, no witnesses beyond the sky and the ground beneath their feet. The promise they made was simple and unspoken, that neither of them would ever own the other. And that fear would not be the language of their home. Children came later. Annie watched them grow beneath open light, their laughter unshadowed by the violence that had shaped her own childhood. When she thought of her father, she imagined him somewhere peaceful, free of the mines that had taken his breath. When she thought of Harold Graves, it was without bitterness. Power, she had learned, lasted only as long as it was obeyed. Annie never forgot the train. She never forgot the moment her life divided cleanly into before and after. But she no longer thought of it as an escape. She thought of it as a beginning. The lesson of her life was not that suffering made her strong, nor that love erased what had been done to her. It was something quieter and harder won. Freedom, she understood, was not given. It was chosen often once, and then again every day that followed. And love, when it was real, did not rescue. It stood beside you while you stepped into the unknown and trusted that you could build something better with your own hands. That was the life Annie Morgan chose.